A crack 60 kilometers long, 8 meters wide at its widest point, 10 days to fully open, over 100 earthquakes in that window. Rock still hot to the touch. Weeks later, scientists from more than a dozen countries flew in within days. 3 tectonic plates pulling in 3 different directions. 1 triple junction exposed on dry land nowhere else on the planet. Not a single volcano erupting. Not a normal earthquake. Not slow drift, measured in careful decades. Not a metaphor either. A continent splitting open in real time in front of instruments. This happened in September of 2005. The location? A desert in northeastern Ethiopia called the Afar Triangle. What geologists found there did not fit any existing model of continental breakup. Nothing like it had ever been documented on land before. 3 tectonic plates meet beneath this desert. Every year, they pull a little farther apart. Herders graze camels across the fault traces daily. A small town called Teru sits 40 kilometers from where the ground opened. Nobody there chose to live on an active plate boundary. They live there anyway, on ground slowly becoming ocean floor. 2 separate instruments recorded the same event, independently. Satellites tracked the ground sinking almost 2 meters along the new scar. Seismometers, placed across the region years earlier, recorded the earthquake swarm that tore it open. Different data. Same rupture, traced twice. The Afar people have lived beside one of these volcanoes for generations. They call it Erta, the smoking mountain. Its deepest pit carries a second name. Local tradition calls it the gateway to hell. Here is a fact most outsiders never hear. Ethiopia evacuated more than 6,000 people from villages near the rupture. Early press reports claimed 50,000 evacuees. The confirmed number, published later, was 6,384. Everyone has heard of Pompeii. Mount Vesuvius erupted close to 4 cubic kilometers of magma in one day. It buried a city under ash. The 2005 rupture in Ethiopia moved a similar volume of magma. It happened underground, not on the surface. It took about 10 days, not one. One eruption buried a city outward. This rupture is building an ocean inward. Why did this take days, not centuries? Why exactly here and nowhere else on the continent? Why did one side of the crack sink faster than the other? Who decided 6,000 people needed to leave, and how quickly? What is actually pulsing beneath this desert right now? By the end of this, it will be clear why scientists call this rupture a doorway, not a disaster. It will be clear why this same desert produced the most famous fossil in human evolution. And it will be clear why a paper from 2025 rewrote what geologists thought they knew about the rock underneath it. This is not really a story about one Ethiopian desert. It is a calibration point for how continents end and oceans begin. The Afar Triangle sits at the northern tip of the East African Rift. That rift is a scar in the crust roughly 3,500 kilometers long. Laid across Europe, it would stretch from London past Moscow. It runs from the Red Sea in the north to Mozambique in the south. For most of that length, it sits 2 to 4 kilometers underwater. The rift's arms are not all the same age. The Red Sea and Gulf of Aden branches began opening roughly 30 million years ago. The main Ethiopian rift, running south toward Kenya, is the youngest of the 3. All 3 still meet at the same point, in the Afar Desert, still actively pulling apart today. Geologists know of roughly 40 places on Earth where 3 tectonic plates meet at one point. Almost all of them sit on the ocean floor, in total darkness, unreachable by hand. Afar is the only one exposed on dry land. A visitor can fly in, drive a jeep across the salt flats. They can touch the exact rock where 3 plates are pulling apart. Triple junctions matter to geologists because 3 plates rarely agree on a single direction. Each arm pulls at its own angle, its own speed. Most junctions eventually fail, with one arm stalling while the other 2 keep spreading. Afar gives researchers a rare chance to watch all 3 arms still active, side by side, at once. The Arabian Peninsula was once attached to Africa. Today, the Red Sea separates them, a strip of water roughly 300 kilometers wide. Arabia has drifted northeast for about 30 million years. Current measurements put that drift at roughly 1 to 2 centimeters a year. The gap widens a little more with every year that passes. South of Afar, the same mechanism works on the Somali plate. That plate carries Somalia, Kenya, and part of Tanzania. It is pulling away from the rest of Africa at roughly 6 to 7 millimeters a year. On a human scale, that number sounds trivial. On a geological one, it points toward open ocean. Picture pulling a sheet of stretched dough slowly apart with both hands. At first, it thins evenly, without tearing. Eventually, a weak point opens, and the tear runs along it. Continental crust stretches the same way, over millions of years, thinning until it finally breaks. Where it breaks, magma from below rises to fill the gap, cooling into new ocean floor. That is the process now running underneath the Somali plate. Geologists call the broader pattern a Wilson cycle, named for the scientist who first described it. Continents split, oceans open between the pieces, and, much later, those same oceans can close again. Afar sits at the opening stage of exactly that cycle, caught on camera for the first time. Researchers who modeled the current rate forward put that outcome within roughly 5 to 10 million years. Beneath the Danakil Depression, the lowest stretch of Afar, the ground sits about 125 meters below sea level. Average air temperature runs above 35 degrees Celsius. In summer, it regularly passes 50. Nearby hydrothermal pools at a site called Dallol have measured a pH close to 0. That is roughly the acidity of battery acid, in water close to boiling. On the morning of September 26, 2005, the ground near Dabbahu volcano let go. It happened at roughly 1 in the afternoon, local time. Gezaheng Yirgu, a geologist at Addis Ababa University, had tracked unusual tremors there since mid-September. He and his team drove out to check field instruments in person. They left the site roughly 2 hours before the eruption started. The world's attention was elsewhere that September. Hurricane Katrina had struck the American Gulf Coast 4 weeks earlier. Global news coverage was still deep in that disaster's aftermath. A rupture tearing open 60 kilometers of Ethiopian desert barely registered internationally at the time. Most people alive that week never heard about it at all. The geology did not need an audience to keep working. A dark ash column rose from a fissure northeast of the summit. It spread into an umbrella-shaped cloud within minutes. The region stayed dark under falling ash for 3 days. Early international bulletins misread the event completely. The Smithsonian's own global volcano report initially attributed the eruption to Erta, more than 100 kilometers away. The two volcanoes sit inside the same rift system, but they are entirely separate structures. Editors issued a correction only after scientists on the ground clarified which volcano had actually moved. Even the world's standard reference for tracking eruptions got the location wrong at first. The eruption itself was small, a 500-meter fissure, a modest dome of pumice. The larger event was happening underground, along a corridor stretching 60 kilometers south of the vent. In the 5 years before the crisis, the district averaged roughly a dozen small earthquakes a year. During the swarm itself, instruments logged as many as 42 in a single day. Over the following 10 days, more than 130 tremors shook the district. Some exceeded magnitude 5. Satellite radar later confirmed what those earthquakes had implied. A wall of magma, up to 8 meters wide in places, had forced its way through 10 kilometers of crust. It split the ground directly above it. Magma under enough pressure does not need to melt rock out of its way. It simply pries the crust apart, the way a wedge splits a log along the grain. Once that crack starts, pressurized magma keeps racing sideways into it, extending the split for kilometers in hours. 3 separate methods converged on that same conclusion. Interferometric radar, beamed down from orbiting satellites, mapped the ground deformation in fine detail. GPS receivers staked across the desert measured the same widening, meter by meter. Seismic instruments recorded the earthquakes that accompanied it. 3 independent data streams, gathered by different teams, describing one identical rupture. Radar interferometry works by comparing 2 satellite images of the same ground, taken weeks apart. Any shift in the ground between those 2 images shows up as a pattern of colored bands. Before 2005, nobody had used that method to watch a rift tear open in real time. Cindy Ebinger, a geophysicist then at the University of Rochester, helped lead the international team that studied the rupture. Ebinger had spent her career chasing one stubborn question. How does a continent stop being one continent and start becoming two, with an ocean between them. Most rifts that answer that question finished the process millions of years ago, buried under ocean sediment, unreachable. Ebinger had deliberately chosen to study the Afar depression instead. It was one of the only places on Earth where that transition was still active, out in the open, where instruments could actually reach it. Before 2005, most of what scientists knew about rifting came from two sources: ancient rock, already cold, already finished breaking apart millions of years earlier, or active mid-ocean ridges buried under kilometers of seawater, reachable only by submersible. Afar offered something neither source could: a live rupture, on land, available to ordinary field instruments. Scientists already knew ocean ridges grow through repeated small injections of magma. What surprised Ebinger was the scale of this one event. A 60-kilometer stretch of crust had broken open almost all at once, not gradually, over centuries, in roughly 10 days. Nothing in the existing models predicted a single event could span that distance that fast. Here is the strangest detail in the satellite data, and it deserves to be flagged directly. The rupture did not open evenly along its length. One side sank measurably more than the other. Magma chambers near the Dabbahu and Gómez volcanoes deflated unevenly as the dike filled. The ground was not simply splitting, it was splitting lopsided, as though pushed by more than one source at once. 20 years later, the 2025 Plume study offered an explanation. The source underneath is not one smooth column of rising heat. It is asymmetric by nature, the paper concluded, off-center, uneven, exactly as the old satellite data had hinted. That asymmetry has practical consequences. It means one arm of the rift can pulse harder than its neighbors at any given time. Predicting exactly where the next rupture lands gets correspondingly harder, not easier. One more record belongs to this same triple junction, and it runs the opposite direction, downward. On November 8, 1978, an earthquake struck roughly 62 kilometers beneath the Afar Desert. It remains the deepest earthquake ever recorded anywhere on the African continent. Ordinarily, crust that thick does not exist under a spreading rift at all. Beneath Afar, apparently, for one recorded moment, it did. Anthony Philpotts, a geologist from the University of Connecticut, joined a follow-up expedition in mid-October. That was roughly 3 weeks after the rupture began. The new fissure and the rock around it were still radiating heat. Parts of it were too warm for the team to approach comfortably on foot. Whatever had split 60 kilometers of ground apart in 10 days was still, weeks later, thermally active underground. The event reshaped how the region gets watched. Universities and government agencies expanded seismic and GPS networks across Afar in the years that followed. They did it specifically because of what 2005 had shown was possible. The magma that filled the 2005 dike totaled roughly 2 cubic kilometers. Mount Vesuvius, for comparison, is estimated to have erupted near 4 cubic kilometers of material at Pompeii in 79 AD. The two numbers sound close. On paper, the comparison looks tidy. Similar volume, similar scale of event. The outcomes could not differ more. Vesuvius pushed its material outward onto the surface, burying a Roman city in a single day. The Afar dike pushed its material inward into the crust itself, leaving almost nothing visible from a passing road. One event destroyed a city in hours. The other is quietly assembling the floor of a future sea. The rifting did not stop in 2005. New magma intrusions followed the same corridor in June of 2006. By the end of 2007, geologists had logged 7 separate dike-forming episodes along that same segment. One of them, in August of that year, produced a 5-kilometer fissure eruption on its own. Each new intrusion opened a slightly different stretch of the original crack. Similar episodes continued through the following years, into 2010. The rifting had not finished. It had only paused between pulses. The 2005 rupture was not even the first of its kind in Afar. In November of 1978, a similar crisis struck the Australopithecus rift in neighboring Djibouti. An earthquake swarm ran for 2 months, peaking at magnitude 5.3. A week-long fissure eruption followed, building an entirely new volcanic cone. Researchers later measured roughly 2 meters of extension across that rift, with the ground sinking as much as 70 centimeters. Before 2005, that 1978 event stood alone in the record. It was the only confirmed case anywhere of ocean ridge rifting caught happening on dry land. Only one other comparable episode exists on record worldwide. That one unfolded at the Krafla volcano in Iceland, slowly, across the 1970s and early 1980s. Afar has now produced 2 of the small number of on-land rifting crises geologists have ever directly measured. This story keeps returning to one idea. A rupture that looks sudden is usually just the visible half of something slower underneath. Subscribe now, because the next section covers what sits directly beneath that slower half. South of the 2005 rupture stands Erta, a shield volcano 613 meters high. It sits in the northern Afar Depression. Persistent lava lakes rank among the rarest features on the planet. Roughly 8 are confirmed to exist worldwide. Erta is thought to have held one, on and off, since at least 1906. Continuous documented activity is confirmed from 1967 onward. Even that record has gaps. One of its 2 lava lakes went dark for several years in the late 1980s before reactivating. A lake of molten rock needs a specific condition to persist at all. The volcano beneath it must stay open, continuously resupplied from the mantle below. Most volcanoes on Earth do not have that kind of channel. Erta does. In January of 2017, the main lava lake's crust gave way. Magma broke through onto the volcano's southeast flank, opening a new vent. New lava flows kept extending from that vent for years afterward. Activity there continued in pulses at least into 2024. The channel from the mantle, in other words, has stayed open for more than a century. South of Erta, inside the Danakil Depression, sits the Dallol hydrothermal field. It is a landscape of sulfur yellow and acid green mineral terraces streaked with rust red. A phreatic eruption in 1926 built most of the terrain visible today. Iron, sulfur, and potassium salts, precipitating out of superheated brine, produce the coloring. Both Dallol and Erta now draw organized tour groups. Visitors travel in armed convoys, a standard precaution in this contested border region. Camel caravans still carry salt blocks out of the depression, a trade that predates any of this research by centuries. Satellite imagery now tracks Erta's heat signature from orbit, day and night, without anyone present on the ground. Tourists and salt traders cross the same ground geologists now describe as an infant ocean floor. Dallol was once a real town, not just a hydrothermal field. An Italian company began mining potash there in 1906. A narrow railway, completed in 1918, once carried salt out to a port on the Eritrean coast. Workers built their houses out of salt blocks, the only material available locally. Flooding and falling potash prices shut the operation down by the late 1960s. Meteorologists studying the area between 1960 and 1966 recorded something unrelated to volcanism entirely. Dallol still holds the official record for the hottest average annual temperature of any inhabited place on Earth. Roughly 34.5 degrees Celsius, year-round. The town closed. The record stood anyway. In 2019, a team led by astrobiologist Felipe Gómez reported something striking. They found ultra-small, salt-loving microorganisms embedded in mineral deposits from one of Dallol's hottest springs. Water temperature there runs near 89 degrees Celsius. The pH measured roughly 0.25. The team proposed Dallol as a working analog for early Mars. The claim did not go unchallenged. Later that same year, a separate team, led by biologist Purificación López Garcia, published different results. Their methodology used additional sample controls. They reported finding no microbial life at all inside the hottest, most acidic Dallol pools. The same held for the magnesium-rich brine lakes nearby. They did find a wide diversity of salt-loving microbes in the surrounding desert and canyons, just not inside the extreme pools themselves. 2 findings, published months apart in the same year, directly contradict each other. As of now, whether anything actually lives inside Dallol's most extreme pools remains genuinely unresolved. The stakes reach beyond one desert in Ethiopia. Space agencies use sites like Dallol to calibrate what counts as a habitable signature elsewhere. Earth's own scientists cannot agree on the limit of life here. That makes reading the same signature on Mars harder, not easier. Something else about the ground beneath Afar looked settled, right up until it wasn't. For decades, geologists assumed the mantle plume feeding this rift was one steady source of heat. They pictured it rising at a constant rate beneath the entire triple junction. Between 2017 and 2024, a research team at the University of Southampton collected volcanic rock samples, more than 130 of them. They gathered them across the Afar and main Ethiopian rifts, segment by segment, over repeated field seasons. Each rock carried a chemical signature of the mantle depth it came from. The team combined that new data with decades of existing geochemical records from earlier expeditions. Statistical modeling then sorted the combined dataset by age and by location along the rift. Collecting those samples took years of repeated expeditions. Teams flew into Addis Ababa, then drove for days across unpaved desert tracks. Fieldwork happened in daytime heat above 40 degrees Celsius, with camp set up wherever the light ran out. Every rock had to be logged, bagged, and carried out by hand. Lead researcher Emma Watts expected a uniform result. She expected the same magma source, repeating consistently along the entire rift. Arranged in order, the chemical results told a different story. They formed alternating bands: ordinary rock, then a sharp spike of unusually deep material, then ordinary again. Each band works like a single ring inside a tree trunk. Read in sequence. The bands trace how the source beneath the rift changed, pulse by pulse, over great stretches of time. Watts and her co-author, Tom Gurnan, a professor at Southampton, checked the pattern 4 separate times. They sent a batch to an independent laboratory in France. The result held every time. Co-author Derek Keir, also at Southampton, summarized the stakes plainly. The finding, he said, has real implications. It changes how scientists interpret surface volcanism, earthquake activity, and continental breakup generally, not just at Afar. Keir has said the team now plans to map how mantle material flows beneath thinning plates elsewhere. The goal is tracing how deep pulses like this one steer surface volcanoes toward the thinnest ground. Similar mantle plumes sit beneath other rift zones worldwide. East Africa's southern branches, parts of the western United States. None of them has been mapped this precisely yet. The magma source beneath Afar was not steady. It was pulsing. That single word rewrites decades of assumption about this rift. Not a candle flame burning at one constant rate. Something closer to a heartbeat, with a rhythm. The team's results appeared in the journal Nature Geoscience in June of 2025. They describe a single asymmetric mantle plume beneath the Afar region. Its rising pulses get channeled differently by each of the 3 rift arms above it. Where the crust runs thin and spreads quickly, in the Red Sea rift, the pulses move through efficiently. Gurnan compared it to blood moving through a narrow artery. Where the crust runs thicker and moves more slowly, in the Ethiopian rift, those same pulses arrive differently. Sharper, more concentrated bursts. The kind that can open 60 kilometers of ground in 10 days. One deep source, 3 plates above it, 3 different rhythms, all responding to the same underlying pulse. One heartbeat, felt 3 different ways. The pattern here echoes something familiar from other slow hazards worldwide. A structure looks stable for 100 years of observation. Then, once someone finally measures it properly, it turns out to have been accelerating in plain sight the entire time. Here, the acceleration is not one fault slipping a little faster each decade. It is a heartbeat running underneath an entire tectonic boundary. It keeps forcing open new cracks wherever it reaches thin, fast-spreading crust, like the ground around Dabbahu. The 2005 rupture was not the first surprising discovery from this desert. On November 24, 1974, a paleoanthropologist named Donald Johanson was working at a field camp called Hadar. He was there with graduate student Tom Gray. The two walked out to survey a nearby gully they had almost decided to skip that day. Within minutes, Johanson spotted a forearm bone eroding out of the slope. A small gray fragment, barely visible against the sediment, was the first piece of a skeleton that would change paleoanthropology. Over the following weeks, the team recovered roughly 40% of one skeleton. That completeness was extraordinary for a fossil that old. That evening at camp, a tape recorder played a Beatles song. It was "Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds." By morning, the skeleton had a name. Formal analysis dated the specimen to roughly 3.2 million years old. In 1978, Johanson worked with paleoanthropologist Tim White and paleontologist Eve Coppens. Together, they described a new species, Australopithecus afarensis. It walked upright, on two legs. Its brain measured roughly a third the size of a modern human's. 1 year after Lucy, in 1975, the same team made a second discovery nearby. They found the scattered remains of at least 13 individuals of the same species. Researchers nicknamed the group the First Family. Their cause of death remains debated. Some researchers point to carnivore tooth marks on a few bones, suggesting predation. Others favor a single catastrophic event, a flash flood or a mudslide, that buried a group traveling together. No consensus has settled the question either way. More than 500 fossil fragments of Australopithecus afarensis have since come out of the wider Afar region, all from one narrow window of geological time, all from one desert that never stopped rifting. Casts of Lucy's skeleton now travel to museums worldwide. The original bones stay secured in Ethiopia, in the country where the rift produced them. The paradox here is hard to avoid. This desert became a cradle for early human ancestors, precisely because it kept tearing itself apart. Rifting open valleys with fresh water and grassland. Rising mantle material altered the local soil chemistry. Unstable, shifting terrain buried bones quickly, in exactly the sediment conditions that let them survive 3 million years. Johanson later wrote that Afar preserved almost every page of its own history. It did so, he said, because earthquakes kept turning those pages open. Without the rift, there may be no Lucy at all, and no fossil record this complete. The same rift that made this desert a birthplace never stopped working. It ran slowly for millions of years. In 2005, it shifted into a visible, camera-ready pulse. Every rupture since has pushed the same desert a little closer to becoming seafloor. South of the Danakil Depression sits a narrow ridge of land near the Eritrean coast. That ridge is currently the only barrier keeping the Red Sea out of the Afar Basin. Cindy Ebinger has pointed out what happens if that barrier fails. Seawater could flood inland long before full seafloor spreading begins on its own. A single sudden event, she noted, threatens nearby populations more than many small ones spread across centuries. Roads buckle. Water pipes snap. Towns built decades ago on ground assumed stable get almost no warning at all. Parts of the Danakil Depression already sit more than 100 meters below current sea level. They wait on the low side of that single wall of rock. Roughly 1,100 people live within 10 kilometers of Dabbahu volcano itself. Roughly 36,000 live within 30 kilometers. The wider administrative district around the volcano holds close to 70,000 residents in total. Beyond that radius, the numbers grow further. More than 500,000 people live within 100 kilometers of that same segment, the one that split open in 2005. Most of them cannot see the fault from the surface on an ordinary day. The nearest paved road can sit hours away by vehicle. Emergency responders reaching a fresh rupture here face days of travel, not hours, across open desert. All of them stand, to some degree, on ground actively becoming ocean floor. Most are Afar pastoralists, herding camels and goats between scattered wells. Their routes cross the rift constantly, season after season, largely unmarked on any official hazard map. Return to those 6,384 evacuees from 2005, and a gap becomes clear. Ethiopia's disaster agency responded within days, sending food and shelter to displaced families. Officials resettled the evacuees roughly 20 kilometers from Teru in a new location called Dabbahu. Relief convoys carried more than 100 tons of food aid to the displaced households. What it could not do, because no model yet existed, was warn anyone in advance. Nobody could say how far the rupture would travel. Nobody could say how many more segments would open in the years that followed. Warning systems here track earthquakes only after they start. Nothing currently predicts days ahead, which 60-kilometer stretch of desert will open next. Set the fault's own timeline against a single human lifetime, and the picture sharpens. A child born in the Afar region today could plausibly live inside the window, researchers now project. On current trends, that window points toward open water. Somewhere in the East African Rift Zone, within roughly 5 to 10 million years. That number sounds impossibly distant against one human life. But the pulses driving it are not distant at all. One already happened within the lifetime of nearly everyone reading this. It happened in 2005, filmed, measured, and published in full. A person born the week of that rupture is now 20 years old enough to have children of their own. Somewhere in that same window, the next dike segment is already loading. Nobody knows which stretch of desert it will choose. The Mantle does not send notice in advance. This particular hazard owes nothing to modern climate change. Unlike glaciers or coastlines, this rift is not accelerating because of anything happening in the atmosphere today. It runs on a pulse, rising from the deep mantle. That rhythm was set long before agriculture, long before Lucy, long before the first hominin crossed this ground. Watching it happen this clearly, on instruments, in real time, is new. The mechanism driving it is not. Every generation assumes the landscape it was born into has always looked this way. It has not. The salt flats tourists now cross by jeep near Dallol sit on old rock. That rock was once part of a single, unbroken Africa. The village of Teru sits 40 kilometers from a scar that did not exist before 2005. Hadar is where Lucy walked upright 3 million years ago. Current projections place that same valley under several hundred meters of seawater within a handful of million years. Ordinary ground, again and again, turning out to be a caldera in slow motion. Some researchers have speculated, informally, about what a future ocean here might eventually be called. No formal name exists yet, and none needs to. The water has not arrived. The naming can wait for the people who will actually see it. Erta Ale's lava lake looked the same to visitors in 1967 as it does today. Underneath, the plume feeding it had already been pulsing for millions of years. Dallol's acid pools looked equally permanent, equally sealed off from the rest of the planet. A team of scientists is still arguing about whether anything can survive inside them at all. Teru looked like an ordinary administrative town before September of 2005. Its residents woke up that month to find their district split by a crack visible from an airplane. Picture a road crew paving a route through Afar today. If they drilled straight down, they would eventually reach the same magma source, the one that opened 60 kilometers of desert 20 years ago. That pulse gives no advance notice. It only announces itself once the ground has already moved. Continuous GPS stations sit bolted to bedrock across the Afar Triangle today. Addis Ababa University helps maintain part of that instrument network alongside international partners. They log the plate's motion to within a few millimeters, year after year. Nobody needs a textbook to see Africa moving. The receivers show it directly, in real time, on an ordinary afternoon. The chemical bands the 2025 team read were, in effect, tree rings cut from the planet's own interior. Somewhere beneath this desert, right now, a fresh pulse of chemically distinct magma is rising through the mantle. Nobody has sampled it yet. Nobody has dated it yet. It is simply rising on its own schedule, indifferent to anyone watching. Eventually, it will surface in a rock somebody finally picks up on some future expedition. It will tell them, after the fact, exactly when Africa's next heartbeat began. Satellites will have already caught the surface moving. Seismometers will have already logged the swarm. The rock will simply confirm, later, what the instruments recorded live.